August 1st, 1995. Westbound lanes of the 10 freeway near El Monte. A white Honda moves through late-night traffic. Inside are three teenagers heading home after a normal evening. Laughter, music, nothing unusual. Behind them, three sedans merge onto the freeway. Too close, too coordinated. The driver checks the mirror. The cars stay on them. One accelerates, another slides into position. Windows roll down. Then, a man climbs halfway out of a moving vehicle. Gunfire erupts. The Honda jerks violently. Glass shatters. The freeway becomes chaos. Headlights, smoke, silence. Within seconds, three young lives are gone. They weren't gang members. They weren't rivals. They were mistaken for someone else. Detectives would later connect the shooting to members of the Asian Boys, a rapidly growing Asian American gang that had begun operating without traditional territory, striking across cities like ghosts. And investigators believed one name sat at the center of the violence: Marvin Mercado, known on the street as Shy Boy. But the freeway execution was not the beginning. It was the peak of something far larger. Because months earlier, a strategy had quietly taken shape. A campaign designed to force an entire city to recognize a gang that felt ignored. What the public didn't know was that Los Angeles was entering what authorities would later describe as a coordinated wave of violence. One that blurred the line between gang warfare and calculated terror. To understand how that night happened, you have to go back, not to childhood, but to the environment that allowed a new kind of gang to emerge. And how a different kind of gang was born. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, Southern California saw the rise of multi-ethnic Asian street gangs formed by immigrant communities navigating poverty, displacement, and street hostility. Many early groups began as protection networks. But over time, some evolved into organized criminal crews. Among them was the Asian Boys. Unlike traditional gangs tied to specific blocks, Asian Boys operated through mobility. Members moved across counties, targeting homes, parties, businesses, anywhere opportunity appeared. This lack of fixed territory made them difficult to track and, according to prosecutors, allowed rapid expansion. Recruitment focused less on geography and more on identity and loyalty. Cambodian, Vietnamese, Filipino, Chinese, Laotian, different backgrounds unified under one banner. This flexibility became their strength, and inside that structure, investigators say one quiet figure began rising. Marvin Mercado didn't match the stereotype of a gang leader. Soft-spoken, calculated, observant. Associates reportedly described him as strategic rather than impulsive, someone who preferred planning over confrontation. But this was only the beginning, because power inside a gang doesn't come from personality, it comes from reputation. The rise, building fear as currency. By the mid-1990s, Asian Boys crews were linked to robberies, burglaries, and escalating violence across multiple Los Angeles neighborhoods. Authorities later alleged that certain factions shifted toward high-impact crimes designed to create notoriety. The objective was simple: visibility through fear. Shootings began appearing across different cities within days of each other. Drive-bys, home invasions, retaliation attacks where victims sometimes had no gang connection at all. Detectives struggled to connect the dots because there was no consistent territory, no predictable pattern. Money flowed primarily through property crimes rather than open drug corners. Stolen goods, cash robberies, and allegedly organized burglary rings. Weapons were shared across crews, making ballistic tracking complex. Street politics also played a role. Larger established gangs dominated reputation. Newer groups often resorted to extreme acts to force recognition. What authorities later described as a coordinated spree began forming. And at the center of it, investigators placed Mercado's crew. But this was only the beginning. Inside the organization, structure without borders. Unlike hierarchical crime syndicates, Asian boys functioned through semi-independent cliques connected by loyalty networks. Smaller groups handled operations locally, while leadership figures coordinated strategy. Recruitment relied heavily on personal relationships, friends, relatives, school connections, community overlap. Loyalty was tested through participation in crimes, a common pattern seen across many street gangs. Mobility replaced territory. Vehicles became operational tools. Surveillance, transportation, escape. Crimes could occur miles apart within hours. Money distribution allegedly flowed upward through trusted circles, while weapons circulated across members rather than belonging to individuals. This decentralized structure created resilience. Arrest one group, another continued. And it allowed leadership figures to remain insulated. But pressure was building. Because by 1995, violence was no longer isolated incidents. It was a pattern. The turning point, the summer of violence. Authorities would later describe 1995 as a defining period. Multiple shootings and attacks occurred within months, some targeting rivals, others involving mistaken identity or opportunistic violence. Families were left with questions that had no answers. Investigators believed the spree was intended to build reputation, a psychological tactic common in gang conflicts where fear acts as deterrence. The freeway murders became the most visible symbol of that strategy. But behind the scenes, something else was happening. Detectives were connecting cases, and once patterns emerge, time becomes the enemy of those committing the crimes. What authorities discovered next changed the investigation entirely. Law enforcement closes. A specialized task force began tracking members across jurisdictions. Surveillance, informants, and cooperation between agencies slowly revealed connections between separate incidents. Witness testimony became critical and dangerous. Some individuals allegedly involved agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced charges or immunity. In gang investigations, this often triggers intimidation attempts, escalating the stakes far beyond the courtroom. Arrests followed. Networks began collapsing. But when authorities moved toward the suspected leadership figures, they were gone. Marvin Mercado and his brother had disappeared. No, not into another city, into another country. The escape, reinventing life in Manila. By the late 1990s, investigators believed the brothers had fled to the Philippines, leveraging family connections and financial support. There, Mercado allegedly adopted a new identity, entered business circles, and integrated into affluent communities in Manila. On paper, he was no longer a fugitive. He was a professional. This period highlights a recurring reality in transnational crime. Distance creates time, and time reshapes perception. As years pass, urgency fades. Witnesses relocate. Evidence ages. But some cases never close. Behind the scenes, U.S. authorities continued tracking leads, building documentation required for international arrest and extradition. For more than a decade, two timelines existed, one of normal life and one of unfinished justice. Eventually, they collided. The raid, when the past returns. In 2007, coordinated efforts between U.S. agencies and Philippine authorities led to arrests inside a luxury residence. Identification relied on biometric evidence, fingerprints and photographs linking the new identity to old records. The arrest ended 12 years of evasion. Extradition battles followed, a common process in international cases where legal teams challenged transfer. But the outcome was inevitable. Mercado returned to Los Angeles, not as a suspect in the shadows, but as a defendant facing multiple murder charges. And the trial would reopen wounds that families had carried for over a decade. The trial, witnesses, fear, and accountability court proceedings revealed the scale of the alleged crimes. Multiple murders, attempted murders, and gang enhancements tied to coordinated activity. Witness testimony became the backbone of the case. Some had participated in crimes, others had survived attacks. Their credibility was challenged, a typical defense strategy in gang prosecutions. But prosecutors focused on patterns. movement, coordination, shared weapons, communication between members. The contrast presented to jurors was stark. Victims' families living with loss while the accused had lived freely abroad. After deliberation, jurors found Mercado guilty on multiple counts. The sentence, consecutive life terms without parole, ensured he would spend the remainder of his life in prison. Years later, related cases involving other members produced additional convictions, significantly weakening the network's violent capacity. But dismantling leadership does not erase an organization. It transforms it. Aftermath. The legacy of mobility gangs, the Asian boys, did not disappear. Like many decentralized groups, activity shifted from overt violence toward narcotics distribution, fraud, and smaller organized crime operations across different states. Law enforcement agencies continue periodic arrests tied to evolving activities, showing how street organizations adapt rather than vanish. The Mercado case became a reference point for investigators studying mobile gang structures, groups without territory, operating through networks rather than neighborhoods. It also highlighted the difficulty of international fugitives integrating into legitimate societies while unresolved crimes remain. For victims' families, the outcome brought legal closure, but not emotional resolution. Because justice answers who, it rarely answers why. If this story stayed with you, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next investigation. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Cases like this raise questions that never fully disappear.